In Indochina, colonial France found itself bogged down by a motley group of Vietnamese revolutionaries. The French made the mistake of underestimating their adversaries. It will cost them dearly. 10 years later, the United States will make the same mistake and pay an even greater price. Always sympathetic to the underdog and acting with the instincts of a good journalist, Wilfred Burchett, on his way home from Korea, decided to visit Ho Chi Minh's forces.
On the way down to Vietnam, listening to the French radio, the military communiques were all dealing with a place called Dien Bien Phu. The French had occupied this place well behind the Viet Minh lines, and from there they would fan out and actually capture the Viet Minh headquarters. When I got to the headquarters, to my great surprise, there was this legendary figure coming out of the jungle, unmistakable figure with its wispy beard, and sure enough, it was Ho Chi Minh. The French had reported several times that he was killed, but here he was, coming out of the jungle with a cape across his shoulders and with a bamboo walking stick. He came into the hut, and after the formalities of asking about my health, I asked him, what is this place that Dien Bien Phu the French are going on about in every radio broadcast? And he took his hat, his sun helmet, turned it upside down on the table, on the bamboo table, and put his hand, he said, Dien Bien Phu is a big valley. It's surrounded by mountains. The cream of the French expeditionary force are there in that valley. We're around in the mountains. They'll never get out.
Đồng tâm ta đều bước, đừng cho quân thủ thoát, ta quyết chí hy sinh. Nào anh em nghèo đâu, liều thân cho đời sống, mong thế giới đại đồng tiến lên quân hồng.
The French never discovered that they had built a road to Dien Bien Phu, because they covered that road up early in the morning. Before sunup, they would plant bamboos and trees and things along the road, and the French reconnaissance plane never knew that there was a road in that last decisive, I suppose, 60 miles. And the French knew that there was a road up to a certain point, and they probably suspected maybe they were carrying supplies on their back, but what they didn't know was that a motorable road along which artillery could be brought had been built. On all the tracks and trails and roads, there were just one moving mass of people and all sorts of transport, from mulebacks, bicycles, special bicycles which they strengthened with bamboo supports, and one man could wheel half a ton of supplies. The colonel in charge of French artillery, before the battle started, he'd been offered extra guns. He said, I have more than enough. The Viet Minh don't even have mortars, and if they do have them, they don't know how to fire them. And it was a great surprise to him when on the very first day of the main attack, their artillery positions were put out of action by Viet Minh. He went into his tent and pulled out a hand grenade and committed suicide. The French, almost until the last moment, were presenting Dien Bien Phu as a big military victory for their side, until the thing actually collapsed. And this was an extraordinary illustration of the Vietnamese tactics, that is to say, to judge the importance of any military action by its political consequences. Dien Bien Phu fell to the Viet Minh the day before the Geneva Conference on Indochina opened. My passport was actually stolen from my pocket in a guest house shortly after I crossed the Vietnamese frontier. I immediately informed the British consul in Hanoi and asked him to relay my request to the Australian government for another one. But that request went unfulfilled for 17 years. I made many, many requests, and requests were made on my behalf by the Australian Civil Liberties Union, other organizations. But the Australian government always refused to replace my passport. In effect, this meant exiling me in Vietnam. I was often reproached afterwards by the Australian government. I stayed so long in Vietnam, I lived in Moscow, I lived in other socialist countries. But in fact, my options were limited by the fact that I didn't have a valid passport. And the Vietnamese issued me with a very magnificent document called a laissez-passer. But this was recognized only within the socialist world, because at that time Vietnam only had diplomatic relations with socialist countries. And obviously this is a very awkward document to be traveling around with you. I couldn't put it in my inside pocket. I always had to have a special briefcase for it and carry it under my arm. Also the fact that it limited my professional activities to a great extent. I made many attempts to return to Australia to get documents anyway, temporary documents to return to Australia, just to take up the case of my passport. And these attempts were all refused.
Saigon, 1962. In bloody street riots, the South Vietnamese openly challenged the authority of the corrupt military regime. Under the Geneva Agreement, free elections were scheduled to unite North and South Vietnam. Fearing a certain communist victory in the South, the Diem dictatorship, now openly propped up by Washington, refused to hold the elections. The long nightmare of American involvement in Vietnam was about to begin. Once again, Australia sent troops to fight with the United States. Once again, Wilfred Burchett found himself reporting a war from the other side.
My sympathy was with the Vietnamese people. They'd been fighting for their independence for literally a couple of thousands of years against Chinese and Mongols and Japanese and French. So when I heard there was fighting going on again, I wanted to go down and have a look at it, see for myself what was going on. And it was natural for me to go to see the National Liberation Front side of the thing. Enough people were covering that war from the other side, from the Saigon side. I felt the other side should be known and should be publicized, because I considered they were the genuine nationalists. They were the ones who were fighting for the country's true independence. It was not an easy thing for myself at the age of 52 to get involved in doing what the guerrillas were doing, forced marches and living on meager rations. So I had to go through a training exercise to prove that I could march quickly, that my legs and muscles were still good, that I could carry a pack, that I could live on rice and very meager rations in order not to embarrass the people with whom I would be traveling. I was the only outsider who had ever visited them, and this was true also of the war against the French. No outside journalist ever visited the South. So I was a sort of morale booster for them, that somebody from the other side had come down to have a look and see what their struggle was all about and share some of their difficulties and hardships and dangers with them. I wore the black pajamas of the Viet Cong and the conical straw hat in order to fit into the landscape as completely as possible. They started off by using bamboo spears, clubs, even stones, some homemade types of guns. They had an odd collection of firearms, some dating back to the early days of the French colonialization. They had very little knowledge of how to use modern weapons even when they captured them. I was extraordinarily lucky during my first long trip of 5 months. Apart from once getting a head cold, nothing happened except on the very last day. Just as we were to have a farewell drink, I suddenly felt a terrible pain in my leg. Somebody sitting alongside me shook my black pajama trousers, and out dropped a scorpion, a black scorpion, quite big. He said, "It's too bad. We have, if it had been a snake or something, we have an antidote, but we have no antidote for scorpion bite." In fact, he said, as I found later, that there practically is no antidote for a scorpion bite. It was extremely painful, like a red-hot needle thrust deep into the leg. Well, I said, "No antidote at all, nothing," he said. So I put my finger in the glass of very potent shum-shum, shum-shum, as the Vietnamese call it, a very potent rice alcohol, and rubbed that on and then drank the rest as an added precaution. I insisted that we get on the bicycles and make off, because I was to cross the frontier that night into Cambodia. We pedaled away for 5 hours on end without stopping. Going through the jungle paths, it's all right, but every now and again we had to cross clearings. We heard several times planes were coming or helicopters were coming. You had to really stand up on the pedals and go full speed to get to the other side. And after 5 hours, I arrived at the base from which I would cross into Cambodia that night, completely exhausted. And they stretched out a hammock for me. I fell into the hammock. I don't know, miraculously, again, they provided a bottle of beer, most of which I drank and went off into a sleep. Although the pain in my leg was still very, rather terrible. I woke up a few hours later, no more pain, my leg wasn't stiff, and was able to carry out the program and cross the border that night. And about a week later, I was in North Vietnam and spoke with the then Minister of Health, Tham Ngoc Tuc, who listened to this account and said, "It's very interesting from a medical point of view, because you did everything you shouldn't have done, and then you did everything you should have done. In other words, you shouldn't have swallowed that alcohol because it only intensifies the action of the poison. But on the other hand, you got on that bicycle and you went at full speed, and between the internal heat from the alcohol and the external heat that's always present in South Vietnam, and the action of pedaling on the bicycle, there's no doubt you expelled the poison." And this is a very interesting, from a medical point of view, it's an interesting scientific experiment. And he laughed. He said, "You know, we could imagine a clinic, special clinic for people with scorpion bites, where you give them some alcohol, you put them on a bicycle on a stand, you make simulated noise of helicopters or dive bombers coming down, and they pedal faster and faster and expel the poison." On several occasions, I had to go into the tunnel systems. These were provided for emergency situations. It might be some planes coming on, helicopter gunships, or an actual attack. And you don't fool around. You go into it quite quickly. The tunnels themselves were rather narrow. They were big enough for the small Vietnamese to crouch and run along. I had to get onto hands and knees, very undignified. Once I got stuck there, and well, the Vietnamese were pulling my arms from ahead and pushing from behind. I got through, but it destroyed that particular slot, which is quite difficult. They had to abandon that section. When I first entered into a tunnel system, they were fairly rudimentary, but still they extended for up to 15 or 20 miles. They actually connected villages with each other. There were storage depots underground and there were hospitals underground. The Americans never did understand the concept of People's War. They had contempt for it. They despised the whole idea. They saw in the Vietnamese, they saw some people in black pajamas up to their middles in mud, and never realized that they were dealing all the time with a very highly complex, organized people. Well, it's not quite like what it used to be, except going down. I'm a little 15 years older, and my stomach is quite a few inches wider. But the system is just the same. Whenever I went to Hanoi, which was relatively frequent, I virtually always had a breakfast with Ho Chi Minh, and sometimes a formal interview, but normally just a long exchange of ideas. He was always interested in my travels and what I'd been doing. He would always start off by asking about the family, the children. That's where I used to meet him in the early days, especially if it was raining. Otherwise, it was out in the garden. President Ho Chi Minh, or Uncle Ho, is known to the Vietnamese people, was a very simple, modest man. He could have lived in the presidential palace, which used to be the palace of the French Governor-General of Indochina. In fact, he chose to live in servants' quarters behind the palace. I asked him once here, I said, well, can I take some photos of you inside the office? And he was very embarrassed. In fact, I don't have an office. If it's raining, I work on a veranda here, and if it's fine, I work out in the garden. And it's true, he didn't have any office. In terms of his accomplishments, and in terms of his human characteristics, I've never met a man like Ho Chi Minh. And I suffered a great sense of personal loss when he died.
Good evening, Ross Simons in Sydney. Fighting has again flared up in Vietnam, with American forces suffering their heaviest casualties in 3 months. 3 Australian soldiers have also been killed. 2 of them were national servicemen. The Australian soldiers were killed in an ambush by the Viet Cong in Phuoc Tuy province. Their deaths bring the total of Australian soldiers killed so far in the war to 277. There were more violent clashes between anti-war demonstrators and police in the streets of Sydney and Melbourne today. Police asked students...
The Vietnam War split the Australian community in 2. Burchett's reports were largely ignored by the conservative daily press, but his articles and books were read where they had the most impact, amongst the anti-war activists, both in Australia and overseas. Wilfred Burchett was still the only Western journalist consistently covering the war from the communist side.
I've come to believe over the years that my duties as a journalist go beyond my responsibilities to an editor or to a publisher, and that my duties as a citizen of the world go beyond my responsibilities only to my own country. In other words, I reject the my country right or wrong.
With Australian conscripts dying in the jungles of Vietnam, Wilfred Burchett's activities brought enormous resentment. In this climate, his repeated requests for a new Australian passport were rejected.
The Australian government went to extraordinary lengths to keep me out of the country. In 1969, for instance, my father was dying. He was 97, almost 97, and I asked to go back then on compassionate grounds, but it was refused. In the end, the question was becoming quite serious for the children. They were approaching the age at which they needed their own identification document. And that is when I forced my way in through the back door, I might say, in 1970 to Australia, to attract public attention to the case and also to fight out the question on the spot. It was arranged that a newspaper proprietor sent over a small private plane, and I flew into Australia with that, and entered with my birth certificate. It was a very scandalous business, and it put the government into great ridicule. On the one hand, they were saying that I was such a terrible person that I must not be allowed back into Australia. And on the other hand, if they thought I was such a terrible person, they should have been glad to get their hands on me. I was fighting to get into Australia, and they were fighting to keep me out.
And here he comes.
Go back to Russia! Go back to Russia!
Come in quietly over the years. I tried to come in very quietly this time, without any publicity of any sort whatsoever.
Oh, no, you're not expecting us to believe that.
Look, is it...
Who caused the delay, do you think?
Do you feel that you've been a traitor to the Allies in this particular case?
I've certainly not been a traitor to the Allies. I've opposed policies in Vietnam. I oppose Australians being killed on Vietnamese soil. If it were Vietnamese invading Australian soil, I'd be supporting Australia. I oppose Australians killing and being killed on Vietnamese soil. And I think a great number of other Australians feel the same way.
Isn't this sort of notoriety a very good investment?
Passport, are you prepared to go to court?
Australian authorities here?
What's that?
Are you going to try and make contact with the Australian authorities here to put your case to them?
Of course, yes.
Do you think you're going to have any chance of success?
I really don't know. I really don't know. The Prime Minister himself has taken such a strong personal position on this that I don't know how that's going to go. I think that there are certain fundamental freedoms that a man is entitled to his opinions and to publish his opinions, and that a government has no right to deprive a citizen of his birthright.
In fact, it was not until the Australian government was changed, that is to say, the Labour government of Mr. Whitlam came to power, and on the very first day after he took over in Canberra, I got a telephone call from the Australian embassy, the Australian ambassador, Mr. Alain Renouf, in Paris, to say he was very happy to be able to inform me that he'd been instructed by Canberra that morning to issue me with a passport. And asked when I was coming along to pick it up. I said, this afternoon, thank you very much, which I did. And I haven't had that problem ever since.
You got the call by the RSL for an inquiry into your activities.
I came back 3 years ago and challenged the government. I took the initiative and said, I want you to appoint an inquiry at which I'll give evidence under oath, and let's clear up whatever you say you have against me. Of course, they refused, and you know very well that the Prime Minister and the Attorney General both made statements in Parliament to say that Burchett had broken no laws, and that's that. And if I had, how could you explain, for instance, that for years the government tried to by all possible means prevent me from coming back? If I had committed some crime, God, they should have had people all over the world trying to kidnap me and drag me back.
Mr. Burchett, how do you react to statements that people call you a traitor?
Well, my first reaction is to ask them to say that in print, and I'll sue them.
You say you're not a communist. Where exactly do you stand politically?
Where do I stand politically? I stand, you know, as a journalist. I take up, first of all, I'm completely independent. I suppose I'm sure it's true to say I'm more independent than anybody in this room.
Would you welcome an inquiry at this?
I wouldn't. If the Prime Minister says, look, you ought to come before an inquiry, I would go before an inquiry. I think it would be an awful waste of time and waste of money.
Are you bitter at the former administration for refusing you a passport?
Well, of course I am. I'm bitter.
Why do you think you were accepted,
It depends what mood I'm in. Sometimes in a mellower mood, and I don't feel bitter. But sometimes when this sort of stuff is kept thrown at me, then I feel bitter at the sort of people that are sponsoring that are behind that.
The return of his passport did not automatically legitimize Burchett in the eyes of his fellow countrymen. The accusations continued. A right-wing magazine described Burchett as a paid KGB agent, a traitor. Burchett fought back. He sued for libel and lost. Costs of around $75,000 were awarded against him, which he could not and did not pay. Burchett left Australia. Until that money is paid back, he can never return. In 1975, after more than 30 years of continual fighting, the Vietnamese finally won their struggle. And it had been Wilfred Burchett's war for most of that time. At least that chapter now seemed closed.
We met there, and then they hit me in the tunnel system because we were attacked. Really? What do you want?
He's much more comfortable in Asia. But even there, he's still a Westerner, still an outsider.
Of course, I thought that when the Vietnamese, the Laotian and the Cambodian people all won their national liberations, I thought, that's terrific. They won their struggles. Their great friend is with them, People's China. I thought that dossier, as far as I'm concerned, one which I'd stayed with longest of any in my reporting career, that was finished. I could metaphorically tie it up with pink ribbon and put it into a pigeonhole, and which I more or less did, and then went off to Africa and started looking into the liberation struggles in the former Portuguese colonies. I could never dream that all that would blow up again, that those four elements would be sort of at each other's throats within a very, very short time.
The end of the Vietnam War was the end of the clear-cut issues for Burchett. Before long, Vietnam invaded communist Kampuchea, its former ally. China, in turn, invaded Vietnam. Forced into taking sides, Burchett chose Vietnam and alienated his old Chinese friends. He reports on the Vietnamese invasion of Kampuchea and sees at first hand the atrocities of the Pol Pot regime, a regime he once supported. The political and moral convictions which sustained Wilfred Burchett for his entire working life are thrown into disarray.
The Khmer Rouge regime, in terms of the extermination of its own people, is one of the most atrocious in world history. What is still a big question mark is how a thing like that could have come about with people who called themselves revolutionaries, communists, socialists, whatever, how they could have degenerated into leading such a regime. I'd always thought that Hiroshima was the most horrific story I would ever have to report on. Later I realized, of course, that Cambodia was far worse. What happened in Hiroshima was to one city. What happened in Cambodia was to an entire nation. I'm still mystified as to how what happened could happen. That's what I'm really interested in finding out.
Nằm xuống đi. Ra đi. Nằm xuống. Trời ơi, tôi cứu mấy ông Tây mà tôi ấy. Nằm xuống. Bên này. Bên đây là. Mau đi chứ.
Well, I thought had somebody opened up, or some group opened up with a light machine gun. You could, of course, the driver was hit with almost the first burst. I could feel his blood coming onto my hands. But he's a terrific chap, and he kept going, and that's what saved us. If he'd stopped, we'd finished. And I remember one great shock, and I thought we'd been hit by a heavier weapon. The blood was pouring down from the driver. I was amazed that he could keep going.
Germans in Cambodia have attacked an Australian journalist and film crew on a major highway about 75 kilometers northwest of Phnom Penh. The journalist, 69-year-old Wilfred Burchett, and the 3 members of the film unit escaped unhurt, but their Vietnamese driver was wounded. The attack took place in open country on Highway 5, near a Vietnamese army post at Kampong Chlan.